We and so please don't make any stock purchasing decisions or anything like that based on any of the conversations that we have here today. So we'll quickly run through kind of the highlights of the agenda and how we operate. And then so we'll, why are we here, right? Will and I decided that this was something important for us to kick off to really help teams and customers engage with each other around how they're utilizing cloud native technologies, specifically in relation to ServiceNow as it stands today. There's a lot of then we found a dearth of information in the world around how companies are utilizing ServiceNow in conjunction with their cloud native technologies, and so we thought we would step up and fill the gap. So who we are, right? My name is Mike Gallagher. I am the Enterprise Application Platforms Manager for DRW Trading. And I lovingly joke that if it's got a 1 or a 0 in it, I've probably managed it at some point in my career. I love all things around ServiceNow, but in particular, IT operations management. I love to focus in. I play with Kubernetes in my spare time because that's how I am. I love to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and hang out with friends and play board games. Matter of fact, I'm going to a board gaming convention next week. So if anybody's there, stop by and say hi.
Nice.
And today I'm going to change it up a little bit. First, I remembered to actually drink my beer after my announcement. And second of all, I normally really only like stouts and dark beers that I can't see through. But today I'm going to drink an Apricot Blonde by Dry Dock Brewing. They're a local brewing company, and it's so delicious that I break my normal taste profile just for this beer.
Nice.
Will?
Okay. Will Hallam. I'm an ITOM architect. I work at ServiceNow and been in technology for about 3 decades. Last decade or so, really focusing on the IT operations management arena, managing things in the cloud, on-prem, trying to find ways to automate repetitive tasks. And that's kind of just organically led me to the ServiceNow platform about 6 years ago. And then I've been working at ServiceNow for a little over 2 years. And in my spare time, I enjoy hanging with my family, playing pickup hockey and video games. Today, I will be enjoying an Uncurious New England IPA from a local brewery in my area, the upstate New York area near Albany. Druthers Brewing Company makes this delightful India Pale Ale, and I will be enjoying it thoroughly as we talk about today's topic, which is external credential stores and using them with your ServiceNow discovery orchestration and service mapping capabilities. And I just kind of came upon this topic just because it's been in the platform for quite a while in terms of connectivity to a supported plugin with CyberArk. We fairly recently announced that HashiCorp had come out with their own integration with their Vault product. So it's come up in conversation quite a bit, but because it had historically been supported with CyberArk, which is a product you can't generally just download and play with, and that's kind of how we do put together a lot of our demo content is, if an external tool is required, it's a lot easier to put together a demo of that if they have like a free or an open source version. So that was always somewhat of a barrier to entry to playing with this capability. And then I just happened to come across a few handy articles that, kind of give credit to as we get later into the talk that talked about, how to create your own. And so I thought that would be a worthwhile exercise. And Mike and I chatted about it and thought, based on his experiences at DRW with the HashiCorp integration and the fact that we both kind of encountered little gotchas here and there, it would be worth doing a session talking about things to watch out for, what we had learned, as we kind of journeyed through getting those external credential stores working in our own environments. So again, we don't really stand up formality here. So anybody, I'm trying to be diligent and make sure everybody's got the power to unmute themselves in the Zoom. Feel free to do that, or just click the hand raise, whatever you're comfortable with. You can certainly throw something in the Q&A. It looks like there's something in there now. Psychotic, GitHub was removed. Isaac, I did not know that we had a psychotic repo out there as well at some point. The two that I ran into were the CyberArk and HashiCorp examples. I'm not sure why that disappeared, but let me just make a quick note. And if I can get any insight, I'll share that in our wrap-up notes. Just because yeah, that's interesting. It could be, I know they so I see you put a link in there. Is that?
Yeah, so that's to the GitHub repo
Yeah.
that it used to have like all the code and data, and now when you go to it, it just says this repository is empty. So I was just curious if you had any insight to it. And it used to have like instructions on how to install like the jar files and how to like pull them down from Psychotic's website and stuff like that, and what to upload into your system to get it all running kind of. So it's interesting that it was removed then. And then it used to be there used to be a link to this GitHub page in the documentation.
Right.
I can't remember which version I had seen it in on the doc site, but now looking at Tokyo and Utah, it's now since gone.
Yeah. Well, you've piqued my curiosity, so I'm definitely going to look into that. If I get any insight, I'll post it, include it in our wrap-up notes. The one thing I do know, because we use this, that's the tool we use internally for like Credential Vault. And I've noticed as a user of that tool that it's rebranded now. So maybe the fact that the company changed hands might have had something to do with it, but that's just a pure guess on my part. I'll, if I find out anything definitive, I will include that in our wrap-up notes that we send out after each session.
Thank you. Yep. That was my curiosity as well too, since I'd seen that rebranding.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. So again, just anybody with a question or comment, feel free to interject as we go through our conversation. So the external credential, just some kind of high points about the external credential capability. Per the name, it lets you piggyback off of existing external credential stores. Currently, ServiceNow officially supports the CyberArk integration, and then HashiCorp has their own integration that is available through the ServiceNow store, which Mike has firsthand experience with. So that's just a little subtlety there in terms of support for the CyberArk integration. First stop could be ServiceNow because it's something that we provide. Whereas if you're a HashiCorp Vault user and you're using their integration, then your primary point of support for that would be HashiCorp. It's support in terms of kind of we've got credentials in use by a lot of the platform capabilities. So this capability is specifically supported for discovery, orchestration, and service mapping. One notable kind of exception that I'm aware of is Service Graph connectors. As far as I'm aware, Service Graph connector for external credentials is still outstanding pretty much across the board for any kind of Service Graph connector that's currently available. And so the way it functions is instead of a full-blown credential in your credential table, you end up creating essentially a stub record in that credential table, which then just has a kind of a handle that refers back to the credential ID. However, it's maintained within the particular external credential store product.
Hey, Will.
Yes.
Do we have to ask Navin what the roadmap is for the Service Graph connectors, or?
I think that is a great idea.
Okay.
I'm gonna take an action to do that. And if I do get some insight, any kind of, ballpark or guidance there, I will include that in the wrap-up notes as well.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. A couple questions in the Q&A from Angie, which I will answer live. Does it support the SFTP or JDBC? So by that, do you mean like the flow actions for SFTP or JDBC connection?
No, so currently the credentials for getting that connection is stored within ServiceNow instance. You cannot put it in CyberArk and kind of retrieve it like what we do with Discovery.
Right.
So that's kind of a gap with our security team. Is there
Sure.
anything in the roadmap that would enable external credentials for those?
Data source integrations.
So like the data source piece, you can either put in a local SQL account, or you can, I'm pretty sure you can configure the connection to use whatever the account is that you're running the mid-server
Yeah.
service off of. And so the mid-server service itself connects to the SQL Server database using its AD, right, credential or rights, roles,
But I
whatever.
saw, if I remember correctly, the configuration still asks for the username and password to be put into ServiceNow. Even though I know it's encrypted, but it still resides on ServiceNow. That's really the problem.
Yeah, true. I've made a note. I will see if I can get any insight into where that is on the roadmap. I do know they are adding some kind of in a related vein. They're adding some enhancements to the credential table and the ability to offload the encryption keys that are used to encrypt credentials to be owned by the customer. So I know that that's available today in terms of a way to mitigate this, kind of mitigate that concern in a slightly different way. So if you're not familiar with that, that's part of the overall suite of functionality referred to as Vault.
So
not too confusing. Got HashiCorp.
We are doing something similar. So I hope this answers the question. So using the integrated authentication. So if you have an AD account versus an application account, so on the data source, you have an option to select integrated authentication, and the mid server that you select, the mid server service needs to be run under that AD account. So
Yep.
So basically your AD admin or the security team could potentially set that password up, and that password can be rotated through the CyberArk or HashiCorp Vault.
Got you. Although that only is possible if you use mid-server, right? Because I think for some SFTP integrations that we use the SFTP Dropboxes outside of our network. So ServiceNow is actually grabbing that directly without going through ServiceNow.
From the instance, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
The instance connecting to SFTP.
That's definitely a foundational feature or limitation, take your pick, of this, the way they've put this capability together, because of the fact that the mechanics behind it are you're basically putting a jar file on the mid that is, handling that credential call. So there's definitely that dependence on the mid. I'm going to make a note and see if there's any, any thought to having an external credential hook that resides on the platform itself. But I'm just guessing that that's probably not something that's actively part of the feature backlog. But I will make a note, and if I can find anything out, I'll include that in our wrap-up notes. Direct, because it is, that's kind of the reason that service graph connectors don't do it today, is because most service graph connectors start out by default directing traffic out, establishing connections from the platform, And not some of them, but not all, have the ability to say, oh, I want to go through the mid. But I think because that was kind of added as a subsequent feature after the initial versions of those SG connectors come out,
Okay.
it was kind of originally coded not to include that call to the external credential hook. But you know, because there's definitely been that, I've heard that question asked before about tying it in with the service graph connector. So that may bring along with it some capability to do those external integrations direct from platform as well. Let's see. Mike, it looks like you had picked another question on the Q&A. Did you want to?
Oh, no, we had already answered it live. That
Oh, right. Service graph connector. Yeah. Not today. I'm gonna see what I can find out from a roadmap perspective, and I'll include that in our follow-up notes. So that one's covered. Bearer token credential types. So let's hold that thought, because Mike made some observations with regard to the credential types supported by the Vault integration. And when I get into kind of my custom integration that I created by following some of our documentation, we can touch on it then as well, because it does look like, in addition to and that kind of is this last point on this one slide, in addition to the officially supported offerings, our documentation includes instructions for creating your own external credential resolver. And I actually went through that exercise for AWS Secrets Manager. And overall, it wasn't terribly difficult. I'll try and share some of the lessons learned. And I actually did a little write-up in a community article about my experience doing that. And there'll be a link to that in the link section of this deck, which we will send out to all our registrants afterwards. So if that's of interest, all those resources will be available for everyone's perusal. Just a quick rundown on why you'd want to do external credentials. Company standards, if you know, and I think Angie, you kind of called out that your internal security team would prefer to have more credentials managed by CyberArk than anywhere else. And that's a recurring theme across the customer base. I came from a CyberArk shop before I started working at ServiceNow. So the ability to tie into that existing tool is a great way to kind of reduce friction in the larger efforts to deploy and maintain the ServiceNow platform. Increased trust, that kind of speaks to the same theme, which is, you know, these are tools that kind of store the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. And so they are heavily vetted and heavily controlled. And so if you can just piggyback on that, instead of having to, you know, enter into the same kind of risk assessment and mitigation around something like the credentials table, especially for credentials that require, you know, orchestration credentials, even discovery credentials, sometimes are afforded a pretty high level of privilege. And so anything you can do to increase the comfort level with the maintaining of those credentials can just, you know, kind of take a few concerns off the ServiceNow platform owner's plate. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead. Most of these tools, if not all of them, provide the ability to automatically rotate credentials. And so again, just piggyback on that existing capability. Obviously, you can rotate credentials via automation in the ServiceNow platform, but why reinvent the wheel if you've already got something in your corporate tooling which does that for you? Another big win that can be obtained by going with the external credential store is just tying into existing provisioning and logging, auditing, et cetera, processes. Yes, you can certainly see when a given credential is accessed in ServiceNow, but if you've already got that logging and auditing in place with something like CyberArk, HashiCorp Vault, then why not just piggyback on that with an integration like this. And yeah, again, just kind of another kind of way to say similar thing is just tying into your own internal resources as opposed to just having a separate place for these credentials, or at least minimizing the rigor behind it. You know, we've already touched on the fact that not every single credential that ServiceNow uses can necessarily be stored in the external store, but the more of that you can leverage, generally the higher the comfort level and the lower overhead on your platform team. In terms of the how to move forward with implementing an external credential resolver, our standard documentation talks about how to activate and configure the CyberArk integration. The HashiCorp integration, as I mentioned, is available on the ServiceNow store. HashiCorp has documentation on how to configure it and install it. And there's a link to that at the end of this deck, which everybody will get shortly after the session. And then there's also those example GitHub repositories that we talked about earlier. Apparently the Psychotic one was out there, but now it's basically just empty. The remaining two that are out there are the CyberArk, and there's an example basically, and it's important to note that both of those repos are intended for as like a starting point. For CyberArk, you can get the official jar file, and that's what you should put in place if you're looking to implement this in production in a supported fashion. Those repos are out there for use as examples, or if the desire is to do a custom solution because your specific needs are unique relative to the off-the-shelf CyberArk jar that's provided. It gives you visibility into what's going on under the covers. It gives you the ability to add some extra print statements, add some extra support for perhaps a credential type that for whatever reason out of the box is not included in the stock jar file. And after going through the exercise I definitely recommend, if you do want to play around with doing a custom provider, a great starting point is to clone one of those repos and then just tweak it to add the specific calls to whatever, if you're using a different product, or just, you can kind of get started with them as is to talk to CyberArk or HashiCorp Vault, and then apply the requisite tweaks that you'd like to. Big kind of a big awareness point is you can't combine these. So if you've got multiple credential stores, you have to align them to a given mid server. You can't throw multiple custom jars on a single mid server. It will get confused, and it'll either pick one and try and use that, or it'll just say I've got multiple jars that implement the same class, and it will be super unhappy. Question in the Q&A from Darren. CyberArk configuration allows the credential to be resolved several ways depending on how the credential ID is entered. For example, it can look in multiple safes or search by IP. Yeah, I did notice that in the documentation. Depending on the format of the credential ID, you can actually have like a unique credential for like a given IP address, which is really nice. Does the HashiCorp Vault provide the same flexibility? Mike, do you happen to know, since you've had some hands-on with the HashiCorp integration?
Yeah, so it actually can resolve multiple different backend secrets engines, as well as it can read, as long as the app role has access to all the right namespaces, then it can read from multiple namespaces. And you'll see when you configure the credential ID, later, you'll see that it calls out in there the path for the namespace all the way down to the credential ID. So yeah, you can pull it from multiple different places.
Okay, the gotcha slide. So Mike and I both have kind of stepped into some potholes as we've done our respective implementations and experimentations with external credential stores. So we just wanted to kind of capture some of those and hopefully help the folks who are here today avoiding any of those pitfalls. It's just, this is the first thing is called out in the documentation. It's just really important because you can have it all set up, and if you don't have this property set, it won't work. So definitely make sure the external credential property is set to true. There's some additional properties I noticed in the HashiCorp documentation that are required. So definitely just kind of be vigilant with running down the documented steps for if you're using one of the two kind of commercial solutions. And even if you're doing a custom one, you have to have this property turned on, or else it won't, it actually won't even show you the option to turn on external credential store when you bring up a credential record. And so, yeah, that was one thing I ran into. I think because I had like freshly installed the plugin and I went immediately to my credential table and tried to create a new credential, I was like, it's not giving me the checkbox. It's not letting me select external credential store. And that was because I think something was cached in my browser. So it wasn't switching to this external storage view when I was listing the credential table. So then when I clicked new, it was just using the default view. And so it would bring up the empty record, but not give me that external, storage checkbox option. So that's more for like, if you've just installed it, after it's been installed and your cache refreshes, then there's actually a business rule that gets put in place such that if this property is enabled, when you go to your credential list, it'll select by default the external storage view, which then gives you the option to check external credential store as an option on the form. SSH private key format. So I learned that, and I think Mike ran into something similar with the HashiCorp one. The mid-server SSH engine is a little persnickety when it comes to the format of the private key. What I noticed is that, so I was using AWS Secrets Manager, which just basically sticks everything in one long line. And what was happening was it wasn't carrying the new line character at the end of the begin statement and and immediately preceding the end statement. And when it was feeding that into the SSH private key engine within the mid server code, it was saying it's an invalid key, and I was my credentials were failing. So it was a simple enough fix. Once I figured that out, I just kind of reformatted the private key string within my plugin, and I'll kind of highlight those lines of code when we dive into the platform side of things. But yeah, Mike, I guess you guys just had to kind of play around a little bit with how you stored those keys in HashiCorp to get it to work.
Yep. And we ended up actually kind of formatting it exactly in this way and got it to work. It took us a lot of attempts to get it right, though.
Was it like a Unix Windows thing, or it's expecting like just 10 or 13 versus 10 and 13 char? Like the carriage return?
No, see, I thought when I first ran into the issue, I thought that what it might have been. So I actually spun up, I think I had started trying it with like a Windows mid, and then I spun up a Linux mid to see if that would, because when I built my custom jar, it would put up a little warning saying something about the locale, and by specifying the IAN something something locale. I was making my jar file platform specific. And since I was building on Linux, I thought that might have been it, but I had the same issue when I tried it with a Linux mid. And what ended up fixing it was I took in the whole key as one big string. I deconstructed it into the begin, the base 64 payload, and then the end. And then I put it back together, kind of like what you see here with the begin, and then an explicit new line, then the base 64 stuff, then a new line, and then the end. And then the mid server was perfectly happy, both platforms. So
Okay.
it was, it was.
Well, I'm glad you guys had that hardship and the rest of us get to skip it. So excellent.
Yep.
Java build tool familiarity, mid-jar file. So if you do have occasion to play around with those two example GitHub repos, you'll notice that the POM file that spells out, that's basically how you list out like the dependencies that your jar has. It's got some, it actually pulls in some jars from the mid server itself. And so they kind of leave it as an exercise to the developer to either like pull down a mid server zip file and stick it somewhere in their build environment so that those jar files are accessible, or just configure, run a mid server. I'm not sure why you'd do that, but maybe some people have a small lab or whatever where the mid server is also their build machine. So in that case, you just have to point the build project at the mid JRE directory, and then it can pull in those jars. It needs some mid jars for things like logging. Like if you want to write some log entries within the mid log, then you need the standard jar that instantiates the classes that are used by the mid to write to the mid log. And one fun aspect of this for me was I don't think I've ever built a Java class before. I don't think I ever had to do that. So I got to learn how to use Maven and, pull in a project and build a Java class and put it in a jar. So if you're like completely not familiar with it, don't let it be too intimidating. There's a lot of stuff out there as far as like basics for using, like I said, I use Maven. I'm sure there's a lot of different Java build tools. One of the articles that I link to in here and in my community article gives you kind of a little getting started how to install like the Java build environment on a Windows box. I was using Linux, so I kind of was on my own there, but if you're a Windows person, there are some basic instructions for getting that set up on a Windows, Windows desktop, laptop that you can follow to get you to where you need to be. Whoops. I keep hitting my scroll wheel when I mean to just kind of gesture with my mouse pointer. So again, back to Angie's question about the supported credential types. So the documentation does specifically list out, these are the supported credential types. Also, if you go to either of the example GitHub repos, that's got part of what the code has is, in fact, this is the last slide, I think. Yeah. So I can actually just jump over to one of those repos and kind of show you what I'm talking about. So for example, with the HashiCorp version, let's see, when we get kind of down here, it's just got a big switch where that kind of shows you all the different credential types for which support is coded into that specific jar. So this has a pretty good list. Bearer token credential type. That would, I wonder if that is actually separate from Kubernetes. I mean, I don't see Kubernetes included here either. So it's probably, I would say it's, yeah, let me just make a note and see if that's on the roadmap. And or what I'll do is I'll take my example, my test setup, and I'll see if I can add support for a Kubernetes bearer token with my custom. And that way I can give you kind of both answers. I can tell you whether, you know, there's anything on the roadmap or whether you should go create an idea to try and get a groundswell to add to that feature. And I'll also let you know if I'm successful in doing that from a custom perspective, because as best I can tell, the only limiting factor is just mapping the whatever field on your external credential store is populated with that, you know, that secret value, and mapping it back to the appropriate field that the mid server is expecting to have. So what I mean by that is, let's see, I think that's in my, let me just bring up my little custom Java class here. So here's the code for the custom resolver I created to use AWS Secrets Manager. And it was just, you know, like I said, you can't just get a free version, community version of CyberArk. And I wanted to be able to show the mechanics behind an external credential store integration. And I already was using AWS Secrets Manager for some other, some other demo stuff. So it was just kind of an easy option to take because I had some credentials I could reference. So what I mean by kind of mapping those attributes, and this code here, I just took this directly from, there's kind of a generic example provided in our documentation as meant as a starting point if you wanted to create your own custom external resolver. And one of the things the example code does is it shows you kind of all of the parameters you can pass to your external resolver, and then all the possible values that it can send back. So these things here, these top lines, these are the values that you can populate. So the two that I kind of focused on are the ID, the credential ID, and then the credential type. And so the credential ID, when you're creating one of those stub records, when you're creating one of those stub records and you select external credential store, one of the fields, by the way, quick plug, if you're not using the SN Tools browser plugin, get it today. It is freaking awesome.
Yeah, it's really good. I think it's called SN Utils.
SN Utils, thank you. So it asks you for a credential ID. So that's what gets populated. This value here is what gets passed in this ID property for the structure that it's passing in. And then the other key one is type. And that's basically like the class, like in this case, it's SSH private key. I did find there was a little bit of, the example GitHub repos were really great in calling out exactly how those are spelled out, because they show up as, shows up as a nicely kind of human readable SSH private key here. But the way it gets passed into your jar is like this, SSH underbar private underbar key. So that's kind of key information that was great to have this example code to look at, to refer to. And then you can also pass in like the IP address that you're trying to talk to and the mid server that is making the request. And then all the stuff that comes back is listed here. And again, all of this it's on the doc page, for which there'll be a link that talks about, basically gives you an example of, hey, if you want to create your own custom external credential resolver, here's how to do it. And so there's the username, password, passphrase, P key is what, and this was a little bit of trial and error. This P key attribute, that's what actually stores the private key. And I suspect that's what you'd have to populate with a bearer token if you're returning a bearer token type. I know that's where, like, if it's an API key type credential, this is what gets populated with the API key. Not to be confused with priv key, which is down here, and I found super confusing, at least initially, but that's actually, so, and I didn't really find any examples of what priv protocol and priv key are used for. So I don't know whether that's maybe a function of what Vault does, where it lets you manage your own external encryption key, and it ties into that. Similar, auth protocol and auth key, they're in the code, but I did not see examples of what that's actually used for. So I don't know whether that's there for future functionality or whether it's just in there because of a desire to kind of make the credential table kind of compatible with all kinds of different credentials, even ones that aren't perhaps kind of part of the mainstream. So, once you get into creating a custom resolver, I think there's at least an opportunity where if there's a credential type that's not supported out of the box, you potentially could add support for those other credential types, provided you could populate the correct attribute to kind of come back and be used by the mid. But I guess more to come on that later, after I have a chance to try that use case with the Kubernetes bearer token and see if I'm able to get anywhere. So one way or the other, I'll let everybody know by way of the wrap up notes. Mike, I'm trying to remember, did you say you ran into some other kind of weird gotchas with the HashiKey stuff, or was it just kind of a matter of just kind of continually just double checking those docs and making sure that everything was in place the way you did? I know you said it was kind of challenging getting that thing completely sorted out.
Yeah, there's a couple of big key components to it, right? You have to have the CLI running on the HashiCorp. CLI has to be running on the machine that you're running from, right? So the mid server has to be able to access locally the CLI, and then the CLI has to have its own configuration file already preset with the app role and the configurations around exactly which namespace to get to and how it should be able to reach out and do that. And what we found is things like, if that process dies, it's effectively just proxying the requests. What that jar file does is it effectively just processes the requests and proxies them through the CLI that are running locally on the mid server. And then the CLI runs out to the actual Vault agent, or excuse me, the actual Vault running in the background. So, you have to configure the address for the CLI to connect up to. You have to ensure that your app role has all the necessary permissions to be able to read the credentials in the namespace that you're trying to gain access to. And then, you have to go through and ensure that even things like, local firewalls are not blocking access into those individual local ports. So it takes a little more tweaking than it would seem at first when you embark on the process. But I think as long as you really follow I found the HashiCorp documentation is very detailed and very thorough. As long as you can follow that pretty closely, you should be pretty good. Yeah, it just takes a few tweaks to make sure you got it right.
Yeah, that was definitely my experience as well. And looking at the instructions for CyberArk, it seems like it's similar, where you need the CyberArk client and or agent. Forget what terminology they use, but basically have to set up your mid as a CyberArk, a trusted CyberArk client first, and then the custom jar piggybacks on that to make the calls into CyberArk. So Mike and I were talking earlier today, and Mike, you commented that the fact you have to do all that kind of does make it difficult to implement this, a little more challenging, at least if you wanted to have containerized mids. So, because we're all about cloud native on, Beers with Engineers, definitely worth mentioning that it does add some additional layers. If you were going to try and do that, there'd definitely be some iteration to try and get a container image running a mid, which also then has those CLI and client capabilities to talk to your CyberArk, your HashiCorp Vault.
Yeah, at that point, you're definitely rolling your own mid server image, and ensuring that for our case, the HashiCorp Vault CLI is installed on that mid server image. And then I would probably recommend that you would configure the Vault config file as a secret, right, and mount it into the mid server, so that way you're not having to constantly hand edit that or configure it around. But that's not something I've actually attempted to do, so I wouldn't don't take my word for it.
That might be why we still have the kind of public GitHub repo for the HashiCorp resolver, because I notice, at least in this comment on the code, it talks about using a zero dependency Vault Java client.
Yep.
So if there's a desire to pull HashiCorp Vault stuff and you're trying to roll your own container image to do it, this may be easier, because if I'm reading this accurately, it claims that you basically just set this up and it'll be able to talk to the Vault without perhaps having to go through the same applying the same layers that HashiCorp provided integration requires. So just something to consider, and just kind of an example of why you might consider a custom implementation, in addition to the fact that there's lots of other providers out there. And I found Secrets Manager to be a great test case, just because I already had an AWS account. So, I was able to just kind of piggyback off something I already had. I didn't have to try and spin up Vault, if you can even do that without buying it. It just seemed to be a lot lighter weight of an effort just to kind of put together some custom credential material. So just to kind of, demonstrate it in the works, it's not particularly, flashy. It just kind of does what it's meant to do. I will probably change this RSA key, even though you can only see a piece of it, but it'll be out on YouTube, so you never know what's going to happen. Yeah, I mean, in Secrets Manager, I just create a little JSON payload with the user and P key values. And then on my instance, I've got this credential record created. I'm not going to kind of reiterate what's in the documentation. Documentation talks about, once you've got your jar file created, you just upload it. And I think this is something, I'm pretty sure this is something we've improved on over the years, because I can remember looking at this a couple years ago, and you had to manually distribute jar files to your mids, which was kind of a pain. But now we've got this handy mid server jar files table. So you create your custom jar file, you upload it, and just attach, you create a record. And the key thing is this record needs to match the record that you create when you're following the documentation. In the Vault configuration table. And that's what kind of produces the pick list when you're creating your external credential. Alex is asking if a mid server can support multiple. And the answer is no. You can only have one external credential resolver per mid server.
Yep.
So you can, so theoretically, if you had multiple Vault, applications, what I do not know off the top of my head is if you do, and you want to distribute different jars to different mids, how you would do that without it just sending every jar to every mid, and then the mids are going to be confused because you're overloading the same class multiple times. So I will take that as an action to research, and I will put my findings in the wrap-up notes. Multiple vaults, different jars. So the way I wrote my little custom provider was I would adhere to a naming convention where this would be the ID that I would put in my stub credential record, and then / and then the credential type would go after the /. And then I just kind of wrote my credential provider when it gets up here to when it first gets called. This is the main kind of method that gets called, the resolve method. I would just tell it to take the ID and the type, concatenate them with a /, and that would be the name of the secret that it would try and pull from Secrets Manager. And the nice thing about Secrets Manager is they literally hand you Java code right here for how to retrieve this particular secret. So I pretty much just stole this code right out of here, stuck it in this thing, and then tweaked it a little bit to make it a little more parameterized. Did not fully parameterize it, so it's hard coded to use my favorite region right now. I definitely don't do that for real, but for playing around, perfectly fine. And yeah, so I just created my stub entry, lock it down to my specific mids, because it's kind of a catch-all test environment. And I was able to successfully run a test. So this will be either a show of success or a show of how to debug. Good night. Oh, I killed that VM. All right, let me find a good VM for a second. AWS, EC2. So, I mean, the nice thing is, and the reason that it's great to include the standard mid-server logging class is that you can just throw log messages and they'll just go to your mid log. And so when it comes to debugging this, which I did a lot of as I put it together, just because I was because I was learning, it was great to just be able to go in the mid log and pull out my debug messages from the SSH session. There's also SSH specific debug flags you can turn on. So if your SSH is a great use case because you can actually turn on explicit SSH debugging on your mid server, and it gives you a load of SSH diagnostic messages. All right, so let's pick this. Whoops, didn't mean to close my browser. Change tabs. Oh, but that's nope. I didn't want the external, I wanted the private. There we go. Credential validated, full success. Awesome, awesome. And so I also went ahead and created a Windows credential. Windows. There we go. Um, 5986 maybe. I'm taking a bit of a guess on the right WinRM port, so if it doesn't come back, I may have to do a quick Google search. Unless anybody, bonus points if anybody knows the port for WinRM secured. Don't ask me what you get if you have beers with engineers bonus points, and we'll have to figure something out if anybody actually has the answer.
Bragging rights.
WinRM ports. All right, I will search.
I think it's 5986.
Yeah, I thought you had it right.
Now, I
Yeah,
may,
85 is big.
I just took the last tested IP address. I may have to grab a valid IP address here. Yeah. Give that a try.
Whoa. There you go.
There we go. And so then I just went ahead and I defined a discovery schedule to hit those devices, and I did a full discovery of my whopping like 4 VMs or whatever it was, but all using those external credentials. And again, that was a great success. And so it just, I think it's pretty cool because you can, immediately resolve issues with like, oh, how are you going to rotate your discovery credentials? Well, we'll just piggyback off the existing facility we have that does that. And
Sorry to jump in, but one
No.
interesting point to point out is that when you're specifically with the HashiCorp Vault integration, when you're in the external credential store view and you go create a new credential and check the external credential store vault, it pops up, hey, here's your little drop down for the external credential stores. And HashiCorp Vault does not get added to that list. It only shows CyberArk. So if you leave it set to none, then it passes the credential request down to the mid server and lets the mid server figure it out. And so if you're using Vault, it's not broken that you can't see that in the list. It's really odd behavior. And also, like, regardless of the documentation, it looks like basically every credential type that is on the platform does have that external credential store checkbox. So you might be able to do this with multiple different kinds of credentials, even if they're not officially supported, as long as the jar file knows how to retrieve those credentials and pass it back into the mid server. So it kind of depends. Obviously, the whole auth like end-to-end method has to go through the mid server in order to use the jar file to connect up to the client and then over to the vault, to the credential store itself. So that's why the service graph connectors likely wouldn't work. However, I do think you could probably make this work with just about any type of credentials that you would like. But that would be totally hacking the crap out of it. So
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth reiterating that, like any customization in the platform, once once you undertake that effort, you kind of, you do own it as far as, ongoing support, making sure that it's all working, following platform upgrades and that kind of stuff. But based on the documentation kind of providing you with the starting point for creating a custom resolver, and the fact that it is pretty straightforward, it's basically take a payload, do some stuff with your external credential provider, and then return a payload. It's pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot of trickiness going on there. The vagaries of the SSH private key notwithstanding. Oh yeah, let me kind of highlight that I had to kind of build some tweaking into my my resolver. So I started up here. Through kind of some trial and error, I was able to generate a regex, which corresponded with what the SSH engine within our mid server is expecting. This regex here on this line, this is what the mid server is expecting a private key to look like. And so what I did, one step back. So what I did first was I went to regex 101 and I figured out what kind of regex our mid server was expecting it to look like. And then I compared that with how the private key from this SSH private key that was being provided by Secrets Manager was providing, and then wrote code to recognize that. And that's what this regex is. And so I use this to kind of deconstruct the private key as it comes in from Secrets Manager. And then based on my regex 101 experimentation, I then reassemble it here, which is basically, like I mentioned when we were on the slide deck, you take the begin string, you add a new line, you stick the base 64 payload in the middle, you terminate that with a new line, and then you add the end string. And that satisfied the mid server SSH engine. I didn't have any of the same challenges with like straight up password type credentials like the Windows one. That one was much more straightforward.
So we're like 7 minutes past time. So
Time flies when you're having fun and drinking beer. There's a couple things in the let's see, Q&A. Angie says thank you. She needs to drop. Thank you, Angie. In retrospect, you can see me thanking you on YouTube. Donnie, hopefully you're still out there. You're able to hang in for us to get your question. If not, you'll see it on YouTube as well. ServiceNow engineer has us add a record to the vault configurations table to be able to select different vaults. If I recall, caveat was that there needed to be a mid-server jar with the same name to handle the requests to that vault. You're correct. So you upload the jar, and that's got that will have a specific, I don't know that the jar record has to have the same name as the vault configuration record. So if we look here at the jar files, so I should have a single jar file record named cred res AWS SM. If I click into it, the actual jar file that's attached is a completely different name. So the jar file itself could be named whatever, at least in my exercise, the name did not match, perhaps bad form, but what have you. The name of the jar file record, credres AWS SM. And then if I go to vaults configuration table, I think then I've got a Vault configuration record that's named CredRes AWS SM. And then that does appear as an option in the pull down for the credentials. So it sounds like that may be the method that you can use to kind of tell it, hey, load in specific jars. I'm just a little concerned that usually I don't know that jars aren't loaded, kind of preloaded, in which case you'd have the class that's defined in those jars is the same class. So if you look up here, it's defining a credential resolver class. And then if I look at one of the example repos, that's also defining a credential resolver class. So if you've got multiple jars on the same mid, and it could just be my, like I said, this is the first like Java build I put together. So it could be Java's just smart enough to load specific jars in and out, in which case good for Java, but unless somebody knows that authoritatively, I will take it upon myself to kind of look into that a little bit and run that down, include that in the notes. Let's see, done. So we've got nothing in QA. I'll just give a quick call for any other kind of topical stuff before I turn off the recording and give folks the opportunity to air, general grievances and ask general questions if they would so like. Going once, twice. Perfect.
Right.